The Redeemer Dependent Dividend Ledger, Founding Rationale, Archival Copy. Persistent Service Asset.
Part 13. ALDEA ZAMÁ Transition District. Visitor Protocol. Open Door Fund. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 12, 2026. Chapter 88. The Second Mediator. Great Lakes Corridor Monitoring Unit. 18-month Stability Review Regional Humanitarian Coordination Office. The ceasefire framework established in Sector 9, sustained continuously for 18 months, has now survived 2 seasonal displacement crises, 1 contested local election, and a resource dispute that historically would have collapsed prior agreements within weeks. This office attributes the framework's unusual durability to a deliberate training investment made 14 months ago. 3 local mediators, selected jointly by both factions' community councils, trained in structured negotiation methodology by the figure local populations refer to as the nuncio, working alongside, rather than in place of existing traditional authority structures. The nuncio's direct involvement in day-to-day mediation has declined steadily over the past 6 months as the local mediator's own credibility has grown. This office notes this as a genuine success of capacity transfer, uncommon in conflict zones of this duration and complexity. The message that arrives differently. Marisol has learned, across 2 years, to recognize the particular texture of hope that costs her something versus the kind that's simply wishful, and the message that reaches her one ordinary Tuesday afternoon carries none of the careful hedging every prior communication from Sector 9 has carried. It doesn't come through Adela No or Isthmus, or any of the institutional channels that have carried news of her sister for years now. It comes directly, routed through the same humanitarian coordination office that first connected them, a single line, unmistakably composed by Vesper herself rather than relayed through anyone else's careful summary. Direct message, Sector 9 to Marisol Ashcombe. The framework holds without me now most days. I have spent 6 months finding out I have less to weigh against nothing than I used to. I don't know what that means yet. I wanted you to be the first to know I'm asking myself the question again. What she does with it. She doesn't call anyone right away. She sits with the message for a long time, the way she's learned to sit with almost everything connected to her sister since the day she first stood in a village with no name and watched Vesper turn a stimulus test into a father's whole unbearable hope, and finds, reading it a 4th time, that she's crying in a way that has nothing to do with grief. She calls Ixchel before Poot, before Isthmus, before anyone official, a habit she's built over 2 years of letting the people who actually stood in the pavilion and argued for a door be the first to know when someone might finally walk through it. She's asking the question again, Marisol says, and doesn't need to explain which question, because Ixchel has carried this file long enough to know exactly what those words mean. Does she know what's changed here? Ixchel says. The medical facility, the training center. We're not the district that made the first offer anymore. I don't want her deciding based on what we were 2 years ago, if she's finally ready to decide at all. I don't think either of us knows what she knows, Marisol says. I think that's the next thing I have to find out. The visit that's different from the first 2. Marisol makes the journey a 3rd time, and this one feels different from the start. Not urgent, not desperate, the particular unhurried quality of a trip made because something might finally be ready rather than because something might otherwise be lost. She finds Vesper in the same village, though the room they meet in this time isn't a negotiation session at all. A quiet afternoon, 2 local mediators handling a minor dispute 2 streets over without any need for Vesper's presence. A fact Marisol notices Vesper herself seems to be noticing, turning it over with something that looks, for the first time, less like calculation and more like genuine uncertainty about what to do with the space it's opened up. Tell me what's changed, Vesper says, before Marisol can say anything at all. The district's bigger, Marisol says. Formal now. A real medical facility under construction. I don't know what it'll be able to do for someone like you. I want to be honest about that. Nobody's promised me anything specific. I know it's more than existed when Ixchel first found you. I know there's a woman named Tomas who fixes things nobody else can fix anymore. Living there, for years into figuring out which parts of himself survived. I know there's a pavilion that's argued honestly about 7 different people so far, and lost money once on principle, and I think it's become the kind of place that might actually be able to hold whatever you turn out to need instead of just offering you a door and hoping. Vesper is quiet for a long time, looking out at a street where two mediators she trained are settling a dispute without her, doing competently and calmly the exact work that used to require the whole of her, every hour, with no room left over for anything else. I don't know if I still know how to be somewhere without a mission attached to every hour of it, she finally says. I want to tell you that honestly, before either of us gets ahead of what this actually is. I'm not saying yes today. I'm not asking you to, Marisol says. The door's been standing open 2 years. I think it can stand open a while longer. What she does say yes to. I'd like to visit, Vesper says finally, and the word lands in the room with a weight that surprises both of them. Not stay. Not yet. I want to see the place that's been holding a door for me before I decide whether I know how to walk through one at all. I think I need that to be true first before anything else. Isthmus Research Collaborative. Field Note. Subject Vesper Ashcombe has requested a supervised, time-limited visit to ALDEA ZAMÁ Transition District, her first voluntary movement away from active field deployment in over 4 years. This is not a recovery. This is not a return. It is, by every measure this organization has learned to value over years of exactly this kind of case, the first genuinely new thing to happen to her in longer than any of us have been tracking. We are treating this with the same patience the district itself modeled for us from the very first pavilion session. No promises, no countdown, just a door and a woman walking toward it slowly enough to still change her mind at any point along the way, which is, after everything this whole saga has ever taught anyone about consent, precisely the only kind of walking toward it that means anything at all. Chapter 89, Ordinary Time. ALDEA ZAMÁ Transition District, Visitor Protocol, Open Door Fund drafted specifically for this case, at Radhika's request. This is not an intake. No paperwork is required, no interview conducted, no assessment made of readiness or fitness. The subject is a guest, entitled to leave at any hour, for any reason, without explanation. The district commits only to being present, ordinary, and unhurried, the same welcome extended to anyone, offering nothing more and nothing less than the chance to notice what a day without a mission attached to every hour of it actually feels like. The first morning. Vesper wakes in a small guest room off the district's shared visitor house, and lies still for a long moment before she understands what's disorienting her. Not the unfamiliar ceiling, not the sound of a rooster somewhere down the street, but the simple absence of anything requiring her immediate attention. No corridor negotiation resuming in an hour. No 400 people whose supply route depends on what she decides before breakfast. She dresses slowly, the way she hasn't had reason to do anything slowly in over 4 years, and finds Sabina waiting in the courtyard when she finally comes outside. Not because anyone assigned Sabina to greet her, she'll learn later, but because Sabina has made a quiet habit across 2 years of being the first face most open door fund arrivals see. I'm not going to ask how you're feeling, Sabina says, by way of greeting. I've learned that question doesn't usually have anywhere to land. This early. I'm going to the market. You're welcome to come or not. Nobody's tracking either choice. Vesper goes. She doesn't say much for most of the walk, and Sabina doesn't fill the silence, and something in the specific, unpressured quality of being allowed to simply walk beside someone without either of them needing anything from the other settles into Vesper's chest in a way she doesn't have a word. The market. It's ordinary in every way that matters. Vendors calling out prices. A child chasing a dog between 2 stalls. The smell of fish and citrus and something frying nearby. And Vesper finds herself standing very still at one stall for longer than the transaction requires, looking at a display of small paper-wrapped sweets arranged. She notices, in a deliberate gradient of color that means nothing to the vendor and everything, suddenly, unaccountably to her. You knew someone who did that, Sabina says, watching her watch it. Not a question. I don't know. Vesper says, honest. The way this whole district seems to have taught everyone who passes through it to be honest without anyone requiring it of them. I felt something. I don't have the part of me left that used to know what to call it quickly. I think that's what 4 years of only ever being asked what a corridor needs does to a person. You lose the fast word for things, and you're left holding the feeling with nothing to put around it. That's not the same as losing the feeling, Sabina says. I've watched that difference matter here more than once. What she asks Tomas. She meets him at the fabrication cooperative 2 days later, at Ixchel's careful, unpushy suggestion. Two people who share almost nothing except the exact same shape of loss, and Vesper approaches the conversation the way she's approached every real question of her adult life, directly, without softening it for either of their comfort. How long before you trusted a feeling was actually yours? She asks him. And not just competence running on its own the way it used to run for someone else. Tomas sets down the component he's working on, considering the question with the same careful attention he gives everything mechanical. I don't know that I trust it fully yet, he says. I know it's been a year, and some days the line's gotten clearer than others. I think the honest answer is you don't get a moment where you suddenly know. You get a lot of small moments where you notice you cared about something before you decided to, and eventually there's enough of them that you stop needing proof. That's not very satisfying, Vesper says. No, Tomas says. I used to want it to be. I stopped needing it to be most days. That's probably the actual answer to your question, if you want the honest version instead of the comforting one. The evening she almost leaves. It happens on the fourth day, not from any crisis but from something smaller and harder to name. A moment at dinner, surrounded by district families she doesn't know, ordinary conversation flowing around her about crop yields and a child's school performance and nothing at all, requiring her judgment or her presence to hold together, and she finds herself standing abruptly, halfway through the meal, breathing hard in a way that has nothing to do with any threat in the room. Ixchel finds her outside a few minutes later, sitting on the low wall at the courtyard's edge, and doesn't say anything at first, just sits down beside her the way Sabina sat with her that first morning. I don't know what to do with a room where nothing needs me, Vesper finally says. I know that sounds like something I should be grateful for. I sat there and felt like I was disappearing instead. You're not disappearing, Ixchel says. I think you're finding out how much of you was actually built around being needed, and how much is still there underneath it, and I think that's a genuinely frightening thing to find out, especially somewhere as ordinary as a dinner table. Nobody's asking you to have an answer tonight. I want to go back, Vesper says. Not because I don't believe this is real, because I don't know who I am at a table where nothing's on fire, and I think I need to know that before I can trust anything I feel here at all. What the door actually means. Ixchel doesn't argue with her. She walks her back to the visitor house instead, and sits with her while she packs the little she brought and says, finally, the thing the district has learned across 2 years and 8 cases now is the only sentence that actually matters at moments exactly like this one. The door doesn't close because you walk away from it tonight, she says. That was always the whole point of building it the way we did. You go back. You hold that corridor together for however much longer it needs you. And whenever the question gets easier to sit with than it was tonight, a month, a year, I don't know, the door's exactly where it was. Nobody here is going to treat tonight as a failure. I don't think you should either. Vesper doesn't answer that directly. She finishes packing and stands in the doorway a long moment before she leaves, looking back at a courtyard that held, for 4 ordinary days, more of an answer than she was ready for. Thank you, she finally says, for not needing me to stay to prove it mattered that I came. Isthmus Research Collaborative. Field note. Closing. Subject has returned to active field deployment following a 4-day visit. We do not classify this as a setback. Every prior case in this saga that eventually resolved toward something like recovery did so slowly, with real retreats along the way, and we see no reason this one should be held to a faster or cleaner standard than any before it. The subject left with a specific, spoken understanding that the invitation remains open indefinitely. We consider that understanding arrived at honestly, without pressure, in 4 ordinary days that asked nothing of her she wasn't ready to give, to be exactly the kind of progress this entire project was built to make room for. Not a rescue completed, but a door that finally means something real to the person standing in front of it whenever she's ready to walk all the way through. Chapter 90, Underfoot. ALDEA ZAMÁ Transition District. Ground truth perimeter 3 days after Vesper's departure. The first indication that something was wrong with the ground was not a collapse, a crack, or even a visible change in the terrain. It was a guava tree that had begun leaning in a direction that made no botanical sense. Mara noticed it because she had planted the tree herself 3 seasons earlier, when the food forest was still little more than a collection of ambitious seedlings and a great deal of exposed soil. She had learned, as most of the people who had stayed long enough in ground truth eventually learned, that the wilderness did not announce its problems with the courtesy of an urban maintenance department. A city waited until a pipe burst or a transformer failed or a street disappeared beneath a sinkhole. Here, the warning came earlier and quieter. A leaf that yellowed at the wrong time, a drainage channel that held water for 20 minutes too long, a tree whose roots began pushing against the surface in an unfamiliar pattern. The guava had tilted perhaps 4 degrees toward the eastern boundary. It was not enough for anyone passing on the path to notice. Mara noticed because she knew where the trunk had been when she last checked it. She crouched beside the root zone and pushed aside the mulch with her fingers. The soil was cooler underneath than it should have been, and there was a faint cavity beneath the surface. She pressed again, this time with the heel of her hand. The ground gave slightly. "That's new," she said. Damian, who was carrying a battery module from the fabrication cooperative, stopped behind her. "What is?" Mara moved aside enough for him to see the depression. "The tree." He looked at the tree, then at her. "Trees move." "Not like that." He set the battery down and crouched beside her. They examined the depression without speaking. It was small, no more than the width of Mara's palm, but it had a definite edge. Beneath the loose leaf litter ran a narrow channel toward the tree's root system. It was not a burrow in the ordinary sense. The soil had been compacted along the sides and removed from the center with a precision that made Mara think of a small auger. Damian touched the edge. "Could be roots." "Roots don't make channels like this." "Termites." "No." "You sound very certain." "I've been watching this patch for 3 years." He looked at her. "Right?" Something clicked underneath them. Both of them stopped moving. The sound came again, faint and mechanical despite the fact that whatever made it was plainly alive. Damian slowly withdrew his hand. "That wasn't a root." "No." "Wasn't a termite." "No." "Wasn't a very ambitious worm." Mara smiled despite herself. "Probably not." The third sound was accompanied by a tiny displacement of soil. A narrow ridge rose between the two of them and then settled again. Mara reached for the inspection probe clipped to her belt. She inserted it into the opening and felt resistance almost immediately. She pushed gently. Something seized the probe. Mara released it. The probe vanished. Damian stared at the empty hole. "That was expensive." "It was your probe." "Exactly." They waited. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then a small section of the earth opened with surprising delicacy, and something emerged. It was about the size of a large domestic cat, though the comparison became absurd the longer Mara looked at it. The creature had a low, heavily armored body and multiple articulated limbs arranged for excavation rather than locomotion. Its shell was not glossy or brightly colored but a dull mineral gray, mottled enough to disappear against the soil. 2 broad forward appendages folded and unfolded with the efficiency of compact machinery. Along the front of its body, several fine sensory filaments moved continuously, sampling the ground. It looked at neither of them. It simply began working. The thing pushed a quantity of soil sideways, paused, sampled the exposed surface, and then disappeared again. Mara remained crouched. Damian said, "What the hell was that?" "I don't know." The answer seemed to satisfy neither of them. They followed the disturbance. By noon, they had found 6 more active passages beneath the food forest. The creatures were not tunneling randomly. Their channels followed the natural contours of the land and intersected at places where runoff had previously caused erosion. In 2 locations, they had reinforced the underside of a shallow slope with a lattice of compacted material. In another, they had opened a narrow drainage route beneath a section of soil that had repeatedly become saturated during heavy rains. The pattern was unmistakable once they knew how to see it. Something was maintaining the ground, not constructing a settlement beneath it, not excavating a secret chamber, not pursuing some mysterious purpose that required a historian, an archaeologist, or a government commission. It was doing maintenance. Very sophisticated maintenance. Mara sat back on her heels and stared at the network. Damian pulled up the district's geological survey on his tablet and overlaid their observations. The match was almost perfect. The creatures had concentrated their activity around exactly the places the survey had identified as structurally vulnerable. "Who designed this?" he asked. Mara shook her head. "Not us." That answer led them eventually to the name Pipe Dream. The identification was made through a maker in the upper tier who recognized the shell geometry from a previous ecological stabilization project. Within an hour, somebody had located a technical bulletin describing adaptive subsurface soil maintenance organisms deployed throughout the Yucatan Transition Zone. The bulletin was years old and written in the kind of language that made remarkable technology sound like a replacement part. The units were intended to stabilize soil, redirect subsurface water, aerate root zones, and reinforce vulnerable terrain without the construction of conventional underground infrastructure. They were self-directed within prescribed environmental parameters and designed to operate for years with minimal human intervention. The ALDEA ZAMÁ district was on the deployment map. Nobody in the district had been notified. Mara read that sentence twice. 3 years, she said. Sabina, who had arrived by then, glanced over the tablet. Apparently. 3 years they've been underneath us. Apparently. And nobody thought we should know? Sabina looked toward the food forest. The guava tree had stopped leaning. Its leaves were already turning toward the afternoon light. Perhaps the people who deployed them thought they were repairing the soil. That's not the point. No, Sabina said. It isn't. She handed the tablet back. But what is the point? Mara looked at her. The point is that someone made a decision about our land without asking us. Sabina nodded. She understood the objection. Ground truth had not emerged from a desire to recreate municipal life with fewer conveniences. Its entire premise rested on direct stewardship. If people occupied wilderness, they accepted responsibility for understanding the systems that sustained it. Water, waste, food, energy, shelter, and terrain were not services delivered by invisible authorities. They were relationships. Pipe Dream had crossed that boundary without malicious intent. That did not make the boundary imaginary. We should ask them to explain themselves, Sabina said. Mara nodded. Yes. And after that? Mara looked once more at the guava. Then we'll decide whether we want them to stop. The explanation arrived the next morning and was almost offensively ordinary. Pipe Dream had conducted a soil stability assessment 3 years earlier. Several portions of the district sat above weak or unstable layers, particularly where the transition from developed ground to food forest created unusual drainage patterns. Conventional remediation would have required excavation, retaining structures, and extensive disruption of the existing ecology. The biological units were considered less invasive. The deployment had been classified as routine ecological maintenance. Routine. That word irritated Mara more than the creatures had. There were hundreds of such operations across the peninsula, the Pipe Dream representative explained. Thousands, perhaps, depending on what counted as an operation. The company maintained enormous distributed systems in which biological, mechanical, and computational processes performed tasks continuously without human supervision. Informing every surface community every time one of those systems crossed an invisible boundary would defeat the purpose of distributed autonomy. We weren't hiding anything, the representative said. Mara looked at him across the table. You didn't tell us. No. That's different. Yes. The representative did not argue. That helped. He explained that the units posed no known hazard to residents and were not designed to interact with human structures except where necessary to preserve soil stability. They did not breed independently. They did not reproduce outside controlled manufacturing parameters. Their behavior was bounded by environmental constraints and maintenance objectives. Damian asked whether the creatures could be removed. They could, the representative said. Would you recommend it? No. Why? Because they're doing exactly what they were deployed to do. There was a pause. What happens if we leave them? Mara asked. They continue. For how long? Until the local stability parameters are satisfied or the maintenance cycle expires. And then, the system determines whether another cycle is required. Mara looked at Sabina. Sabina was smiling. Not because she found the situation funny, because she recognized something. We've been asking Pipe Dream to explain itself, she said. Perhaps we should be asking ourselves why we're so surprised. Mara frowned. What do you mean? Ground Truth has been doing the same thing. She gestured toward the surrounding district. We built systems that don't need someone from the city to come every morning and tell us whether they're functioning. We wanted infrastructure that understood its environment well enough to respond to it. She looked down at the soil. They did. Mara was silent. The objection had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. The discovery escaped the district before the formal report did. That was inevitable. A young man from the former occupation posted a photograph of one of the creatures emerging beside a drainage ditch. Someone recognized the species. Someone else recognized the deployment pattern. By evening, the story had crossed the boundary between the regularized settlement and ALDEA ZAMÁ, and by the following morning a maker collective had begun asking whether the shell material could be locally fabricated. The reaction was not uniform. The former occupation residents were fascinated first by the practical question. Could it stabilize their own terrain? Some of their streets and lots still suffered from the consequences of years of improvised construction, drainage problems, and the removal of trees to maximize usable real estate. The regularization process had given many families legal security and access to formal services, but it had not magically repaired the ecological damage already done. A ground truth technician visiting the area explained the pipe dream system to a group of residents. They listened. Then one woman asked the question that changed the conversation. Why are we waiting for the city to fix this? Nobody answered immediately. She pointed toward the other side of the boundary, where the food forests and decentralized systems of ground truth had been quietly demonstrating another way to inhabit the landscape. They already know how to do it themselves. That was the beginning of something. Not a program. Not a grant. Not a municipal initiative. A copy. Within weeks, several households began experimenting with decentralized drainage and soil management modeled on ground truth practices. Their first attempts were crude. Some failed. A few flooded. One collapsed entirely and had to be rebuilt. But the second generation worked. Then the third. The same pattern repeated with water capture, waste processing, and distributed energy. The former occupation did not become ground truth. It became something that had learned from ground truth. That distinction mattered. The people who had spent years waiting for conventional urban infrastructure to recognize them began discovering that recognition and dependence were not the same thing. They could retain their titles, their streets, their schools, and their municipal relationships while progressively reducing the number of things that had to arrive from outside. The city had promised them services. The wilderness was teaching them systems. The upper tier noticed later. It always did. Not because its residents were less intelligent, but because they had different priorities. Behind walls and gates, private compounds already possessed their own water systems, generators, security networks, and sophisticated domestic infrastructure. What interested them was not whether the ground truth model worked. They wanted to know whether it could be made better. A property owner approached the makers. A systems engineer approached the former occupation. A private estate offered laboratory space to a young fabricator who had never previously been invited through its gate. A programmer from Ground Truth began consulting for a residence whose owner had once considered off-grid habitation an eccentric hobby for people who could not afford the grid. Nobody announced that the classes had merged. They hadn't. The walls remained. The wealth remained. The differences in taste, privacy, status, and access remained. But competence moved. That was harder to contain. The upper tier began recruiting people who could operate at its increasingly demanding technical threshold. Some came from universities. Some came from former corporate laboratories. Some came from ground truth. Some came from the old occupation. The qualification was becoming less about where someone lived than what they could do. A person who could maintain an autonomous water system, repair a fabrication unit, diagnose a biological substrate, manage a distributed energy network, or design an improvement that saved an entire compound 10% of its resource load could move through the district very differently from someone who possessed money but required a technician for everything. The healthy loop was beginning to feed itself. Ground truth produced techniques. The former occupation adapted them at scale. The SECZ provided capital and fabrication capacity. The upper tier supplied resources and demanded higher performance. The innovations moved back downward. And the people who had begun at the bottom were increasingly capable of moving upward. Not everyone did. Not everyone wanted to. Some preferred the old certainties. Some wanted municipal services, a conventional house, and a quiet life. Others wanted nothing to do with the upper tier. That was fine. The transition did not require everyone to become the same. It required enough people to discover that there were more ways to live than the old system had taught them to imagine. 3 days after the pipe dream discovery, Tomas walked past the guava tree. He stopped. The tree was upright again. He studied the soil around its roots for a few seconds and then crouched. Something moved beneath the surface. He waited. A small section of earth opened. The armored creature emerged, examined him, and remained perfectly still. Tomas reached down, not to touch it, just to look. For reasons he could not explain, the shape of its excavation pattern seemed familiar. Not the animal, the logic, the way it had mapped pressure through the soil and responded before the failure occurred. He watched it work for nearly a minute. Then he stood. Sabina, approaching from the path, saw him. "Do you know what it is?" Tomas shook his head. "Not exactly. What do you know?" He looked down at the creature disappearing beneath the earth. "It knows where the ground is weak." Sabina smiled. "Useful. Very." He looked toward the district beyond the food forest, where houses, workshops, gardens, private compounds, former occupation neighborhoods, and experimental infrastructure were beginning to form a pattern that no single planner had designed. Then he looked back at the soil. "I think that's how most of this place works." Sabina waited. Tomas continued. "Things find the weak points. And then..." He watched the earth settle over the creature. They reinforced them. Neither of them noticed the small sensor node that had remained active beneath the roots. It registered the pressure of Tomas's footsteps. It registered the movement of the tree. It registered the moisture level in the soil. It registered the passage of the two humans. Then it returned to its maintenance cycle. Above it, ALDEA ZAMÁ continued becoming something nobody had yet found a final name for. Below it, the ground held. Chapter 91. The Integration Threshold. The pipe dream organisms became old news in ALDEA ZAMÁ faster than Mar expected, but not before they had done something more consequential than attract curiosity. They had provided the district with a small, almost accidental demonstration of how much of the transition was already happening without anyone having declared a transition. For the first week, residents photographed them, argued about whether they were beautiful or repulsive, asked whether they could be handled, and complained that Pipe Dream should have notified them. By the second week, the practical questions had taken over. Could their soil stabilization principles be reproduced without the organisms? Could the biological material be fabricated locally? Could the same approach be adapted to slopes, foundations, terraces, and water retention basins? Could the organisms themselves be requested rather than merely discovered? The answers were complicated, but they were not discouraging. That was enough. The district had learned something more important than the details of the technology. It had learned that infrastructure did not necessarily have to announce itself as infrastructure. A service could be embedded in the landscape, distributed through living systems, and allowed to perform its function without requiring a municipal department, a permanent workforce, or a visible administrative hierarchy. The discovery had not converted anyone to ground truth, but it had made the ground truthers' assumptions considerably harder to dismiss as eccentric. That distinction mattered to Sabina. She had spent enough time watching people misunderstand the movement to know that its real proposition had never been live primitively. The proposition was almost the opposite. Wilderness habitation was not an escape from technology. It was an attempt to remove unnecessary dependencies between technology and centralized urban systems. If a settlement could produce its own water, energy, food, sanitation, and fabrication capacity, then the question was no longer whether it possessed the infrastructure of a city. The question was whether it needed the city to remain functional. That was a much more dangerous question. It was also one that people in the former occupation were beginning to ask. And once they started asking it, the answers began spreading. The first serious demonstration took place behind a house that had been occupied long before the regularization process had begun. The property had acquired a legal title, but its drainage system had never acquired anything resembling a coherent design. During heavy rain, water collected along the rear wall, found its way beneath the foundation, and emerged 3 days later in a neighboring lot. The family had spent years improvising channels, pumps, and barriers. Each solution created another problem. A ground truth technician named Lucia had been invited to look at it. She did not propose a municipal connection. She did not propose a larger pump. She walked the property twice, looked at the slope, asked where the water came from during the first 10 minutes of a storm, where it went during the next hour, and where the family stored organic waste. Then she asked why the family had removed the largest tree on the property. The owner, a man named Hector, shrugged. It was in the way. Of what? The house. Lucia looked at the empty space where the tree had been. Now the water is in the way. Hector did not appreciate the observation. He appreciated the result. 3 months later, the property had a small catchment system, a planted drainage corridor, a root zone filtration bed, and a compact treatment unit fabricated by a maker cooperative 2 kilometers away. The pump remained, but it had become a backup rather than the center of the system. The family's dependence on municipal drainage had been reduced without abandoning its connection to municipal services. The neighbors noticed. Then they copied it. The process was neither ideological nor coordinated. People simply copied what worked. That was how ground truth had always expected transition to occur. Not through conversion, through demonstration. The upper tier noticed the same phenomenon from a different direction. Its residents had never been particularly interested in the politics of ground truth. Some found the movement admirable. Others regarded it as an elaborate form of recreational poverty practiced by foreigners with unusually expensive equipment. A few had become enthusiastic patrons of particular projects, but the majority had remained comfortably behind walls, gates, and layers of private infrastructure. That was beginning to change. The wealthy had a different relationship with inconvenience. They could afford to eliminate it. When a municipal service failed, they purchased a private alternative. When electricity became unreliable, they installed generation and storage. When water became uncertain, they drilled, filtered, captured, and recycled. When security became problematic, they added sensors, drones, and personnel. But the more sophisticated their private systems became, the more obvious the limitation became. They were still dependent upon people capable of maintaining them. A private estate could purchase a bioreactor. It could not purchase the person who understood why its microbial balance had shifted at 2 in the morning during a heat event. It could buy a fabrication system. It could not guarantee that the technician capable of rebuilding its critical component would remain available. Could employ a programmer. It could not ensure that the programmer understood the physical infrastructure the code was controlling. The upper tier therefore began looking outward. Not for labor, for competence. That distinction changed the social geometry of ALDEA ZAMÁ. The first person to notice was not a developer or an administrator. It was a 16-year-old maker who had been repairing agricultural sensors for people in the occupation. A private compound had lost communication with part of its irrigation network. Its imported service contractor could not arrive for 9 days. The young maker fixed it in 40 minutes. He was paid more for that afternoon than his family had previously earned in several weeks. The compound offered him a regular position. He declined. They offered him access to the fabrication facility instead. He accepted. 6 months later, he was still living with his family. He was also designing components for 3 private estates and 1 ground truth agricultural cooperative. Nobody had told him that he had crossed a class boundary. Nobody needed to. He had crossed a technical one. That was when the phrase integration threshold began circulating. At first it referred to something quite mundane, the minimum level of competence required for a person to participate in certain technical systems without becoming a liability to everyone else using them. The upper tier had always had thresholds: security clearance, financial capacity, professional credentials, social connections. But those were becoming less useful as predictors of actual competence. A person could be wealthy and still be unable to operate an autonomous water system. A person could possess a university degree and still have no idea how to maintain a fabrication cell. A person could be born into ALDEA ZAMÁ's most exclusive compounds and have no capacity to function without the servants and contractors who made the compound possible. Conversely, someone could arrive with no money, no title, and no institutional credentials and become indispensable within months. The new threshold was therefore partly technical and partly behavioral. Could you understand the system you entered? Could you maintain it? Could you learn? Could you troubleshoot without immediately demanding someone else take responsibility? Could you contribute improvements rather than merely consume functionality? Could you be trusted with autonomy? Those questions became increasingly important. And once they did, the threshold began rising. That was not necessarily exclusionary. It was simply demanding. The people who wanted access to increasingly sophisticated environments discovered that they needed to become increasingly sophisticated themselves. Ground truthers were particularly well positioned. They already understood the principle. The former occupation learned it quickly. The upper tier had resources to accelerate it. The SECZ provided places where the resulting competencies could be commercialized. The loop was beginning to feed itself. The first person to articulate the loop formally was not an economist. It was an ex-Redeemer engineer. His name was Arturo Velasco, and he had acquired a reputation for being unpleasant long before anyone began describing him as visionary. He had spent 14 years at Redeemer before the collapse, most of them in infrastructure integration. He had survived the legal assault without being convicted of anything, although surviving had cost him almost everything he owned. By the time he reached ALDEA ZAMÁ, he had already learned not to speak about Redeemer unless someone asked. People asked anyway. The district was full of former employees. Some were technicians. Some were executives. Some had been field officers. Some had worked in compliance. Some had been lawyers. Some had been people whose names appeared in documents they had never expected to see quoted in newspapers. Arturo had little patience for nostalgia. When someone referred to the old company as a lost golden age, he corrected them. There was no golden age. When someone called Redeemer evil, he corrected them too. There was no evil age. There had been systems. Some had worked. Some had failed. Some had worked so well that nobody noticed what they depended upon until they were dismantled. Some had failed because people had been given too much discretion. Others had failed because people had been given too little. Arturo had spent years thinking about that distinction. Now he was thinking about something else. The installations. The first acquisition happened almost quietly. One of Redeemer's former Quintana Roo facilities had become a stranded asset after the corporation's collapse. Its ownership had been tangled in litigation and its equipment had been frozen under various orders. By the time the legal situation became sufficiently clear for a sale, the market had decided the facility was worthless. Arturo disagreed. He knew what was inside. So did 3 other former Redeemer employees. They pooled their resources. The purchase price was absurdly low compared with the replacement cost of the infrastructure. They bought it. Then they bought another. Then another. They did not call what they were doing a resurrection. They called it asset recovery. The distinction was deliberate. The facilities were old. Some equipment was obsolete. Some systems were damaged. Some were legally unusable. But the physical installations represented something the market had not understood. Embedded knowledge. A building designed by people who understood a particular process was not equivalent to an empty building. A laboratory with obsolete equipment could still contain ventilation architecture, power distribution, shielding, water systems, waste handling, and spatial arrangements that would cost millions to reproduce. A fabrication facility contained more than machines. It contained a history of what machines had been needed, where they had been placed, how they interacted, and which failures had already been experienced. The buyers knew all of that because they had been there. They were buying the memory of a dead corporation in physical form. And ALDEA ZAMÁ was close enough to make the transaction interesting. Arturo's first visit to the SECZ planning office lasted 11 minutes. He did not present a vision. He presented a balance sheet. The official across from him looked at the figures. You want to seed the district? Yes. Why? Because the district is going to need fabrication. We already have fabrication. You have makers. Is there a difference? Very much. Arturo pointed to a line in the proposal. You have people who can make things. What you don't have yet is enough capacity to manufacture the things they discover they need. The official studied him. And you want to build that capacity. I want to finance it. Why? Arturo leaned back. Because I've spent most of my life watching people destroy useful systems because they didn't understand what they were destroying. I'd like to try something else. The official smiled faintly. That's almost sentimental. Arturo's expression hardened. Don't insult me. The official laughed. That was how the first seed agreement began. The money did not create the transition. It accelerated it. That was the distinction Arturo insisted upon. The district already contained the ingredients. Ground truth had demonstrated decentralized habitation. The former occupation contained an enormous population with practical knowledge, labor, and an appetite for improvement. ALDEA ZAMÁ possessed underused high-end infrastructure. The SECZ had the beginnings of a legal and commercial framework. The former Redeemer population possessed technical knowledge that had become economically stranded. The ingredients had been sitting beside one another for years. Nobody had assembled them. Now somebody was beginning to. The process did not make the district harmonious. If anything, it made disagreements sharper. Ground truthers objected when private interests tried to appropriate their methods without understanding their ecological assumptions. Upper-tier residents objected when SECZ rules threatened private autonomy. Former occupation residents resented being treated as an underqualified labor pool. Makers complained about being invited into elite facilities and then subjected to restrictions they considered absurd. Old Redeemer employees disagreed among themselves about almost everything. Some wanted to rebuild the old product line. Others wanted nothing resembling it. Some argued that the old corporation had been destroyed precisely because it had tried to do too much. Others believed its greatest failure had been stopping too soon. The arguments were not signs of failure. They were signs that the system had become alive enough to argue about its own direction. Tomás encountered the integration threshold without knowing the phrase existed. He had been working in the fabrication cooperative when a representative from one of the upper-tier compounds came looking for him. The man was polite. He was also visibly uncomfortable in the workshop. Tomás noticed that immediately. People who came into the cooperative expecting a conventional machine shop usually spent their first 5 minutes looking for the boundaries. Where was the manager? Who approved the work? Who was responsible? Who signed the requisition? The representative asked none of those questions. He had been briefed. You're Tomás Reyes? Tomás looked up from the component he was holding. Yes. I've seen some of your work. Tomás waited. We have a problem. What kind? One we don't understand. Tomas smiled. Those are usually the interesting ones. The representative hesitated. Our estate uses a closed-loop cooling system. It was designed by people who are no longer available. We've had intermittent thermal instability for 6 months. The contractors have replaced the control hardware twice. Did they inspect the heat exchangers? Yes. The fluid? Yes. The control logic? Yes. The physical mounting? Yes. Tomas put the component down. Then why did you come here? The man smiled. Because everyone who understands one part of the system says the other parts are working correctly. Tomas nodded. That's a common problem. Can you look at it? Probably. The representative waited. How much? Tomas considered the question. I don't know yet. Fair. How long do I get? Whatever you need. Tomas stood. I'll come tomorrow. The man looked relieved. Then Tomas added, but if I find that the problem was caused by someone changing the design without understanding it, I'm going to tell you. The representative smiled. That's why you're being invited. Tomas didn't think much about the conversation afterward. He did not know that the phrase integration threshold had already begun appearing in private planning documents. He did not know that several people had begun asking whether his unusual abilities represented a special case. He did not know that his name was moving through circles of people who possessed enough resources to change the trajectory of his life without ever asking him whether he wanted his trajectory changed. For the moment, he only knew that someone had a broken machine. That was enough. He went back to work. Outside the workshop, the evening light moved across ALDEA ZAMÁ. Behind one wall, a private estate was beginning to redesign its infrastructure around people like Tomas. Beyond another, ground truthers were testing a new water system. Across the boundary, families in the former occupation were experimenting with decentralized sanitation. Below them all, Pipe Dream continued its quiet maintenance. And somewhere farther south, men and women who had once worked for a corporation everyone believed was dead were buying another abandoned Redeemer installation for a fraction of what it had cost to build. They were not yet calling it a beginning. They were still calling it recovery. Chapter 92, Recovery. The first Redeemer installation was purchased so quietly that, for several weeks, almost nobody in ALDEA ZAMÁ understood what had actually changed hands. There was no ceremony, no restored sign above the entrance, no press release announcing the return of a company whose name had become sufficiently radioactive that merely pronouncing it in certain circles could still provoke an argument. The property had been sitting in a peculiar legal and commercial limbo since the collapse, its machinery depreciating behind layers of dust and litigation while lawyers debated ownership, creditors disputed claims, and former employees watched from a distance as pieces of their professional lives were gradually reduced to line items on somebody else's balance sheet. The buyers knew better than the lawyers what they were looking at. They had worked there. They knew which rooms had been built around processes that no longer existed, which electrical systems had been over-engineered because an engineer had once anticipated a failure that never came, which cooling loops could be brought back into service with relatively little work, and which pieces of equipment were obsolete except for one irreplaceable component that could no longer be purchased anywhere. They also knew which apparently valuable systems were architectural dead ends, products of the old Redeemer habit of solving a problem so completely that the solution eventually became more complicated than the problem itself. There was no nostalgia in their inspection. Nostalgia had become expensive. They walked through the facility with flashlights, tablets, and printed copies of old schematics, arguing over what could be salvaged and what should be dismantled. Some of them had not spoken to one another in years. Others had remained in contact throughout the collapse, bound together less by friendship than by the peculiar solidarity of people who had once belonged to an institution and then watched the world decide that belonging had been evidence of guilt. Arturo Velasco was the first to say what everyone else was thinking. We shouldn't rebuild it. They were standing in what had once been a systems integration laboratory. Half the ceiling panels were missing, and vines had entered through an exterior seam and followed a cable tray toward the floor. Someone had removed the old Redeemer equipment tags, but the adhesive outlines remained. "What should we do then?" asked Miriam Cho. Arturo looked through the room before answering. "Build what we learned how to build." Miriam laughed softly. "That's a very expensive distinction." "It is." "How expensive?" "Less than rebuilding the mistakes." That ended the joke. The people in the room had heard versions of that argument before, but this time the circumstances were different. They were no longer employees petitioning management to alter a system. They were no longer officers trying to convince a board that an existing product could be made safer. They were no longer engineers working under a regulatory framework whose assumptions they considered incomplete. They were owners of a piece of the wreckage. For the first time in years, they could decide what happened next. That freedom frightened some of them more than the old restrictions had. The legal purchase had been deliberately conservative. They acquired the real estate, the fixtures, and whatever equipment could legally be transferred without dragging the entire historical dispute back into court. They did not purchase the Redeemer name. They did not attempt to acquire the old corporate identity. They did not claim succession to the old company. That mattered. The old Redeemer had been the object of too many lawsuits, investigations, political campaigns, and moral crusades for anyone with sense to attempt a theatrical resurrection. The people buying the installations understood that the quickest way to lose everything again would be to announce that they were bringing Redeemer back. They were not bringing it back. They were taking possession of what remained useful after everyone else had decided it was worthless. The distinction was not merely legal. It became philosophical. A former executive who had once been responsible for a division's finances proposed a formal principle for the recovery effort. It was eventually written on the first page of the internal charter. No recovered system is reinstated merely because it worked before. Every system would be examined again. Every process would be subjected to the accumulated experience of the collapse. Every safeguard that had existed for a reason would be retained until somebody could explain why it was no longer necessary. Every safeguard that had merely existed because an old regulator had demanded it without understanding the underlying risk would be examined with equal suspicion. The former employees were not interested in revenge against the people who had destroyed their careers, but neither were they willing to reproduce the conditions that had made the destruction possible. Their institutional memory had become their greatest asset. It was also their greatest source of disagreement. Some remembered Redeemer as an organization that had been ahead of its time and destroyed by people who could not understand it. Others remembered the internal compromises, the ambitious officers, the shortcuts, the products that had escaped their designers' ability to control them, and the occasions when the corporation had convinced itself that a good objective justified a dangerous method. Both memories were true. The recovery project became stronger because nobody was allowed to erase either one. The second installation was larger. It had once supported a regional operations center and still possessed a power system capable of supplying considerably more than the surrounding district required. Its communications infrastructure was obsolete by commercial standards but astonishingly useful as a physical platform. The property itself had been valued almost entirely according to its land and conventional development potential. That valuation amused the former Redeemer people. They had learned long ago that the most expensive thing in infrastructure was often the part nobody bothered to value. The acquisition group purchased it for a fraction of its original construction cost. The savings were not distributed as profit. Not initially. They became seed capital. The first conversations with the SECZ were therefore conducted in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion. The district authorities knew who the buyers were. The buyers knew what the authorities thought of the corporation they had once represented. Nobody was particularly interested in pretending otherwise. The SECZ representative who eventually sat across from Arturo had reviewed enough history to be cautious. "You understand why people are going to object," she said. "Of course. They'll say you're reconstructing Redeemer under another name. They'll say that whether we do or not. That doesn't make it irrelevant." "No," Arturo said. "It makes it something we have to answer." She studied him. "And your answer?" Arturo placed a folder on the table. We are offering to finance the district's technical infrastructure without asking the district to adopt our corporate governance model. That got her attention. He continued before she could interrupt. We want the SECZ to have fabrication capacity, research capacity, power redundancy, water independence, and computational infrastructure. We want former Redeemer personnel to be able to work here without recreating the corporate structure that employed them. We want local makers to have access to equipment they could never afford individually. We want the district to become capable of manufacturing the things it currently imports. And what do you want in return? Nothing exclusive. She looked at him skeptically. Nothing. We want the district to succeed. That's not an answer. It is the answer. He leaned back. The assets we're buying are worth almost nothing to the market because the market doesn't know what to do with them. We do. If the SECZ becomes productive, those assets become productive. If the people here become more capable, the assets become more valuable. If the district develops new technologies, we benefit because we live here and because we will be participating in the economy that develops around them. That's the return. She looked down at the folder again. You expect me to believe this is altruism? No. That answer surprised her. I expect you to believe it is self-interest with a long enough horizon to become useful to everybody. The agreement was not signed that day, but it was not rejected either. The first practical consequence was a new fabrication program. It began with 12 machines that had been sitting idle for years, a group of makers who were accustomed to improvising around the limitations of consumer equipment, and a handful of former Redeemer engineers who had forgotten how little other people knew about the systems they had once taken for granted. The engineers had to learn how to teach. The makers had to learn how to receive instruction without allowing themselves to become dependent upon the instructor. That produced friction. The former corporate engineers were accustomed to documentation, tolerances, certification, and controlled procedures. The makers were accustomed to opening the machine, looking at what had failed, and trying something else. Neither side was entirely wrong. The breakthrough came when someone stopped trying to determine which culture was superior. They were solving different problems. A maker needed to know how to keep something functioning when the intended component was unavailable. An engineer needed to know whether the improvised replacement would continue functioning under load. Once they understood that the two questions belonged together, the workshops changed. The machines became more useful. The makers became more rigorous. The engineers became less precious. And the SECZ acquired something that had been missing from the beginning, an institutional environment in which practical knowledge and formal engineering could correct one another without either being subordinate to the other. That was the beginning of the district's real manufacturing capacity. The former occupation noticed before the administrators did. People came to the fabrication facilities because they needed something repaired. Then they began asking whether they could learn how to repair it themselves. Then they started bringing problems that had never been intended for a fabrication shop. A water pump housing cracked. Someone made a replacement. A solar controller failed. Someone reverse engineered it. A sanitation component could no longer be imported at an acceptable price. Someone redesigned it for local production. A family needed a replacement part for an agricultural system and had no money to buy the original. A maker produced one. The part worked. The family returned 2 weeks later with 3 neighbors. This was how the SECZ became useful. Not through grand projects. Through thousands of small refusals to remain dependent. The former occupation had once measured development by the arrival of services. Now some of its residents began measuring it by the disappearance of things they needed to wait for. That change was subtle enough that officials initially missed it. Then the statistics became impossible to ignore. Municipal electricity consumption began falling in some neighborhoods while household productivity increased. Water demand from the central system decreased without a corresponding decline in population. Waste volumes dropped as more material was processed locally. The demand for certain imported components declined. The number of people with practical technical certifications rose. And, perhaps most revealingly, households that had previously depended upon one or two technically skilled individuals began developing internal redundancy. People were learning. The transition was no longer a program. It was becoming a habit. The upper tier responded in the way upper tiers usually responded when they discovered that something previously dismissed as peripheral had become valuable. It began buying access. At first, this meant hiring. Private estates recruited technicians from the SECZ, offering salaries that the cooperatives could not match. Several people accepted. A few disappeared almost entirely into private service. The ground truthers criticized the movement. Some of the criticism was justified. A system built around shared competence could be weakened if its best people were absorbed by private interests. But the process also exposed a weakness in the old conception of class. The people being recruited were not being selected because they were wealthy, well-connected, or socially acceptable. They were being selected because they were good. That made the boundary porous. A programmer from the former occupation could become a private systems architect. A ground truth water specialist could become a consultant to a compound whose owner had previously regarded off-grid habitation as an eccentricity. A maker could gain access to facilities that had previously been inaccessible to anyone without a conventional professional credential. The wealthy were still wealthy. The walls remained. Privacy remained. Status remained. But capability had become a currency that could cross those walls. That changed the social balance more profoundly than any declaration of equality could have done. The first person to articulate the danger was one of the ground truthers. He was a Canadian engineer named Mark Dufour who had spent years refusing offers from private estates. "The upper tier will eat the ecosystem," he said during a meeting of the local stewardship council. Sabina disagreed. "Only if we let them. They're buying people. They're hiring people. Same thing." "No." Sabina looked around the room. "We need to be careful about the distinction. If someone leaves because they were offered better conditions, that isn't theft. If our system can't retain people because we cannot offer them what they need, that's a problem we have to solve." Mark frowned. "And if they take all the best people? Then we train more." That answer irritated him. Sabina understood why. Training more people took time. It required patience. It required accepting that the first generation of technicians would make mistakes. It required letting people fail without turning every failure into an argument for central control. But that was precisely the logic ground truth had been built around. The objective was not to preserve a fixed population of specialists. It was to increase the number of people capable of doing difficult things. If the integration threshold rose, the answer was not to lower it. It was to help more people reach it. Tomas reached the threshold without ever being told that there was one. The private estate that had contacted him about its cooling system turned out to be more complex than the representative had described. The problem was not a defective component but an interaction between three systems that had been installed at different times by three different contractors. Each system behaved correctly in isolation. Together they created a feedback loop that only appeared under a narrow combination of load, temperature, and water flow. Tomas found it in 2 hours. He did not fix it immediately. Instead, he spent another 3 hours tracing the history of the installation. When the estate's manager asked why, Tomas explained that the immediate fault was not the important part. "If I fix this without understanding how it happened, you'll have the same problem somewhere else." The manager looked at him. "How many people have told you that?" "Nobody." "Then you're probably the first." Tomas returned to the system. The repair took another day. The redesign took 4. When it was finished, the estate's energy consumption had fallen significantly, and the cooling system became more stable than it had been when new. The manager offered him a permanent position. Tomas declined. He was offered a consulting arrangement. He accepted. The difference mattered to him, although he could not have explained why. He did not want to belong to the estate. He wanted to be able to walk away from it. That was another form of sovereignty. The upper tier understood immediately. They did not need to own him. They needed him to remain willing to work with them. That was a more sophisticated relationship. By then, the former Redeemer employees had begun to recognize something that had escaped them during the corporation's final years. Their greatest mistake had not necessarily been building systems that were too powerful. It had been building systems inside a structure that had become incapable of learning from its own failures without first defending its own legitimacy. The new environment was different. Nobody expected the recovered installations to be perfect. Nobody expected the former employees to be saints. Nobody expected the old products to return unchanged. The only thing expected was that they should become better. That requirement was surprisingly difficult. Every improvement created a new risk. Every safeguard created a new constraint. Every simplification removed something someone had once considered essential. Every optimization changed the economics of another component. The former Redeemers discovered that rebuilding their technological inheritance required something the old corporation had rarely possessed in sufficient quantity. Time. Time to disagree. Time to test. Time to fail without the failure becoming a scandal. Time to admit that the people who had condemned them had occasionally been right. Time to admit that those same people had sometimes been catastrophically wrong. Time to build again anyway. They had not recovered Redeemer. They had recovered the opportunity to become something that Redeemer had never been allowed to become. And the first people to benefit were not the former employees themselves. It was the district around them. The same district that had once been regarded as a collection of disconnected interests was becoming an ecosystem in which wealth, technical competence, ecological knowledge, practical improvisation, and institutional memory could circulate. Not equally, not peacefully, not without exploitation, but increasingly productively. For the first time, the people rebuilding the old installations could see a possibility that had been impossible above ground. The corporation had once needed the world to permit it to operate. This new system might not need permission. It would need something more difficult. It would need to prove that its existence made the people around it more capable rather than more dependent. That was a standard the former Redeemers could live with. They had spent too many years learning what happened when they failed it. Chapter 93, The Second Life. By the time the third Redeemer installation changed hands, the people buying them had stopped pretending that they were merely acquiring cheap real estate. The fiction had been useful during the first transaction, when lawyers, creditors, and municipal authorities were still sufficiently nervous about the company's name to prefer the language of distressed assets. Nobody wanted to say that former Redeemer personnel were buying Redeemer facilities because they intended to use them. That would have invited questions about succession, liability, intellectual property, and, more dangerously, whether the institution that had supposedly been dismantled was beginning to reconstitute itself somewhere beyond the reach of the people who had dismantled it. The buyers understood the danger. They were not stupid, and most of them had already spent years being punished for things they had actually done, things they had been accused of doing, and things that had happened somewhere inside an organization they had once been unable to control. They had learned that the distinction mattered only to lawyers and historians. To the public imagination, Redeemer had become a single creature, and every person who had worked inside it could be made to represent the whole. Some had lost their careers. Some had lost homes. Some had spent years defending themselves against accusations that had never survived contact with evidence. Others had emerged wealthy enough to withstand the damage but had discovered that money did little to restore the professional identity that had once given their lives structure. The company had been destroyed, but the people who knew how it worked had not disappeared with it. Those people were older now. They had accumulated the peculiar knowledge that comes only from surviving the failure of something enormous. They remembered what the manuals said, but they also remembered what the manuals omitted. They knew which safeguards had existed because someone had thought deeply about a genuine danger, and which had been added because a committee had become frightened of its own shadow. They remembered products that had been prematurely terminated, prototypes that had never received sufficient funding, field systems whose performance had exceeded every expectation, and administrative decisions that had turned manageable problems into catastrophes. Most of all, they remembered the technological lineages that had been broken when Redeemer was dismantled. Not just patents and source material, but the tacit knowledge embedded in teams that had spent years learning how apparently unrelated systems behaved when connected. That was the knowledge they were buying back from the wreckage. The first installation had been acquired almost as an experiment. The second demonstrated that the economics were real. The third made the pattern undeniable. Every acquisition lowered the cost of the next one because the group now possessed the personnel capable of evaluating the properties without depending upon conventional consultants. They could look at a dead laboratory and distinguish between a liability and a sleeping asset. They could look at a warehouse full of outdated equipment and identify the 10% worth preserving. They could look at a server room and know which machines contained obsolete hardware and which contained architectures that could be repurposed for applications the original designers had never anticipated. They had an advantage that no outside investor could purchase at any price. They remembered what the machines had been built to do, and they had no intention of making the old mistake of rebuilding everything exactly as it had been. The first internal memorandum circulated among the acquisition group was therefore deliberately blunt. It stated that recovered Redeemer products would not be treated as sacred artifacts, nor would they be discarded merely because their original corporate context had become politically unacceptable. Each would be evaluated according to 3 questions: what had worked, what had failed, and what could now be done differently. The third question was the one that mattered most. The people writing it knew that the old corporation had been trapped by its own success. It had created systems whose capabilities became increasingly difficult to govern within the assumptions of the institutional environment surrounding them. Its opponents had responded by treating the capabilities themselves as the disease. The former employees now had the luxury and the burden of considering another diagnosis. Perhaps the problem had been the container. The SECZ became the first place where that hypothesis could be tested without having to be proclaimed as doctrine. The district needed money, but money was not its most serious shortage. It needed productive capacity. It needed equipment that could manufacture things rather than merely consume them. It needed people who knew how to repair complex systems and, just as importantly, people who could teach others to repair them. It needed a regulatory environment capable of accommodating technologies that did not fit neatly into the old categories without surrendering the safeguards that had been learned through painful experience. Above all, it needed enough economic activity to prevent the transition from becoming another beautifully articulated dependency upon outside capital. The former Redeemer Group offered seed funding. The SECZ accepted it on terms that neither side found entirely comfortable. That was probably why the arrangement worked. The investors did not receive control over the district. They received participation rights, access to certain facilities, preferred commercial treatment within defined limits, and the ability to establish ventures under the SECZ framework. The district retained jurisdiction over its own governance. The agreement was deliberately constructed so that neither side could simply absorb the other. Arturo insisted on that point. He had seen too many institutions become extensions of their largest investor. If we own the district, he told the other former Redeemers, we'll eventually reproduce the corporation. Miriam looked up from the draft agreement. And if they own us? Then we've reproduced the corporation from the other side. She smiled. So what exactly are we trying to build? Arturo considered the question longer than she expected. A place where we can make mistakes without having to pretend they're successes. That became the principle behind the investment structure. It also made the SECZ attractive to people who had no interest in Redeemer's history. For the makers, the attraction was obvious. Equipment that had previously been inaccessible became available. A fabrication cell could be booked rather than purchased. Specialized materials could be ordered collectively. Engineers were available to troubleshoot problems that would previously have required importing expertise. Small ventures could test products without immediately having to become corporations large enough to justify the overhead of conventional manufacturing. For the former occupation, the opportunity was different. Their community had accumulated a large practical workforce, but practical labor had historically been rewarded poorly because it was abundant, and because the city had been designed around the assumption that the most valuable knowledge arrived with credentials. The SECZ began disrupting that assumption. A person who could diagnose a failed water system, fabricate a replacement component, maintain a distributed energy installation, or improve a food production system could command more value than someone with a respectable title and no practical competence. Ground truth had been making that argument for years. The SECZ was giving it a market. The transformation was therefore not a charitable uplift of the former occupation. It was more uncomfortable and more productive than that. People who had spent years expecting formal services to arrive began discovering that the quickest way to improve their circumstances was sometimes to learn how to provide the service themselves. The process did not happen uniformly. Some residents wanted nothing more than the conventional promises that had finally been made to them: legal title, electricity, sewage, roads, schools, and reliable municipal administration. There was no shame in that desire. After years of uncertainty, normality possessed its own dignity. But younger residents increasingly saw the ground truthers doing things that seemed almost absurdly efficient. Their water systems worked without depending on distant pumping infrastructure. Their waste streams were treated as resources. Their food forests reduced the need to transport certain staples. Their shelters were adapted to the climate instead of forcing the climate to conform to an imported architectural model. Their energy systems were distributed, reparable, and redundant. When something failed, the failure was often visible to the people responsible for it rather than disappearing into an administrative department somewhere else. The first generation of imitators copied individual devices. The second copied systems. The third began copying the philosophy. That was when the change became difficult to reverse. A family would install a small solar storage system and discover that the next logical step was water capture. Once water capture existed, the garden became more useful. Once the garden became productive, organic waste acquired a purpose. Once waste was being processed locally, sanitation became less dependent on the municipal system. Once several houses operated this way, the neighborhood discovered that its infrastructure could be coordinated without becoming centralized. None of this required abandoning the city. It required abandoning the assumption that the city had to be the only system capable of supporting civilized life. The former occupation did not become a ground truth settlement. It became something more interesting, a conventional neighborhood progressively acquiring wilderness-grade autonomy. That evolution was noticed by the upper tier. The wealthy residents of ALDEA ZAMÁ had no ideological obligation to admire ground truth. Many continued to prefer walls, private roads, controlled access, private security, and large houses whose architecture announced their wealth without apology. Some considered the new transition culture entertaining. Others regarded it as a temporary fashion that would eventually settle into a familiar hierarchy once enough money had entered the system. But their estates had one vulnerability that money alone could not solve. They were becoming technologically sophisticated faster than they were becoming technically self-sufficient. A compound could purchase an autonomous power system, but someone had to understand its architecture. Could purchase a closed-loop water system, but someone had to diagnose microbial drift. It could install advanced fabrication equipment, but the equipment became useless if nobody could maintain it. It could employ an artificial intelligence to optimize its infrastructure, but optimization did not eliminate the physical reality of broken valves, degraded membranes, failed sensors, and contaminated feedstock. The upper tier began recruiting from the SECZ. At first, it recruited conservatively, selecting people with conventional credentials. Then it discovered that some of its best recruits did not possess them. The young technician from the former occupation who had repaired an irrigation network in 40 minutes became one of the most sought-after systems troubleshooters in the district. A ground truth woman who had spent years developing decentralized water systems was hired by 3 private estates to redesign their emergency water architecture. A maker who had once built agricultural components from discarded equipment became responsible for maintaining a private fabrication laboratory whose annual equipment budget exceeded the entire neighborhood in which he had grown up. The money flowed upward. The knowledge flowed sideways. The techniques flowed downward again. That circulation produced a social environment unlike either the old city or the old corporate model. Wealth remained extraordinarily uneven. Private estates remained private. People continued to care about prestige, privacy, luxury, and access. But the upper tier had begun to discover that the people it needed most were not necessarily the people it had traditionally considered socially important. The integration threshold emerged from that realization. It was not a formal caste boundary. It was not a test administered at a gate. It was a practical expectation that anyone seeking access to the most sophisticated parts of the district should be capable of understanding enough of the systems around them not to become a permanent dependency. The threshold could be crossed, could also be raised. Every time a new technology entered the ecosystem, the level of competence required to participate safely increased. That frightened some people. Others found it exhilarating. For ground truthers, it was almost self-evident. Autonomy was not a right conferred by rhetoric. It was a capability that had to be developed and maintained. The former occupation learned that quickly. The upper tier learned it more slowly. The XREDMRS understood it immediately. They had spent years watching institutions collapse because their systems had become more sophisticated than the people governing them. They had no desire to repeat the experiment. Tomas encountered the upper tier without seeking it. The invitation came through the fabrication cooperative after a private estate experienced a failure in its cooling architecture. The estate's managers had already replaced several components and brought in outside specialists. Every intervention had solved the immediate symptom while leaving the underlying problem untouched. Tomas spent a day examining the system. He found that 3 subsystems had been designed at different times according to different assumptions about load. None was defective. Their interaction was. He explained the problem to the estate's technical director, who listened with the expression of someone watching a very expensive puzzle finally acquire a simple shape. Can you fix it? I can redesign the interface. How long? 4 days. Can you do it here? Yes. Will you need our staff? Some of them. Will you need our engineers? Tomas thought about that. They'll need to understand what I'm changing. The director smiled. That's not what I asked. It's my answer. The work took 5 days. When it was finished, the system consumed less energy, produced less waste heat, and required fewer interventions. More importantly, Tomas documented the modification thoroughly enough that another technician could maintain it without him. That was what impressed the estate more than the repair. He had not made himself indispensable. He had made the system less dependent on him. The offer that followed was generous. Tomas refused employment. He accepted a long-term consulting arrangement under conditions that gave him complete freedom to decline work and prohibited the estate from claiming ownership over inventions he developed independently. The agreement surprised several people. It surprised Tomas most of all. He had expected them to try to buy his time. Instead, they had recognized the value of his autonomy. He began receiving invitations from other estates, then from SECZ Ventures, then from people he did not know who wanted his opinion on systems that had nothing to do with the work he had originally been doing. He accepted some. He refused many. He never understood why people found this remarkable. To him, the principle seemed obvious. If he belonged to everybody, he belonged to nobody. Meanwhile, the recovered Redeemer installations were beginning to wake. The first facility was producing again. Not Redeemer products. Not yet. The former employees were deliberately refusing to put the old labels back on the machines. A biocomputing platform was being rebuilt from a design that had been abandoned during the final years of the corporation. Its architecture had been simplified, its maintenance requirements reduced, and several safety assumptions changed. A distributed energy system was being tested against the old field data. A medical platform was being reconsidered from the opposite direction. Not how much functionality could be packed into it, but how much complexity could be removed without losing the capabilities that had made it valuable. The engineers disagreed constantly. That was encouraging. They had once been trained to defend their departments. Now they defended their reasoning. A younger engineer asked Arturo why they were spending so much time studying old failures. He answered without looking up from the archived report. Because the people who destroyed us didn't have to live with all of them. The engineer frowned. What does that mean? It means they were allowed to see the failure as an event. Arturo finally looked at him. We had to see everything that came after. The younger engineer understood. Product could be withdrawn. Contract could be terminated. A corporation could be dissolved. But the people who had depended upon the product did not disappear when the product did. The infrastructure that had been built around it remained. The expertise required to maintain it disappeared. The people trained to use it lost their work. The suppliers collapsed. The research programs were abandoned. The unfinished projects were never completed. The benefits that might have emerged from the next iteration ceased to exist because there was no next iteration. The old world had measured the destruction in corporate terms. The people rebuilding the installations were measuring it in lost futures. That was why they were not interested in revenge. Revenge would preserve the old argument. They wanted to know what could still be recovered. The answer was larger than any of them expected. Not because the old Redeemer technology had been perfect. It hadn't been. The answer was larger because the years of collapse had stripped away the assumption that every useful system needed to remain inside a corporation. The recovered installations became laboratories. The SECZ became a market. Ground truth became a source of techniques. The former occupation became a source of people. The upper tier became a source of capital and demanding applications. The pipe dream systems provided an example of infrastructure that could operate beneath the visibility of conventional institutions. And the former redeemers brought something none of the other groups possessed in comparable concentration: the memory of an entire technological lineage. The pieces had not been designed to fit together. That was precisely why their combination became so productive. A ground truth water system could be improved by a former Redeemer engineer. A former Redeemer biocomputing platform could be made cheaper because a local fabricator discovered a different manufacturing method. A private estate could finance a prototype that the SECZ then adapted for broader use. A sanitation solution developed in the former occupation could become an exportable product. A pipe dream soil technology could be integrated into food forest planning. Each improvement created another. No central authority controlled the process. No single ideology explained it. The district was becoming a place where systems learned from one another. And that, more than the buildings or the legal structures or the money, was what made the emerging economy difficult to classify. It was neither conventional capitalism, nor a commune, nor a municipal redevelopment project. It was an ecosystem in which ownership, stewardship, technical competence, reputation, and contribution had begun to overlap without becoming identical. The former Redeemer people recognized the pattern before anyone else. They had spent their careers trying to build integrated systems. Now they were living inside one. The difference was that this time the system was not owned by a corporation. It belonged to everyone who could contribute to it, everyone who depended upon it, and everyone capable of changing it. That made it harder to control. It also made it much harder to destroy. Palms up together, BTC.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
Ground truth. What this document is not. Not a manifesto in the revolutionary sense, those age badly and attract the wrong readers. Not a guidebook in the lifestyle sense, that gets absorbed into the wellness tourism aesthetic immediately. Not a political tract, that requires the youth to adopt a framework before they've solved their housing problem. What this document could be. Closer to a field manual with a soul. Written in a register that treats the reader as already intelligent, already disillusioned, already capable, not as someone who needs to be convinced that the old system is broken. They know. Skip that part entirely. The pressure mechanism. Here's the political geometry underneath the cultural one. A countercultural document that circulates globally and positions ALDEA ZAMÁ's undeveloped terrain as the world's most compelling Zone B destination does something the developer cannot undo with a press release. What is actually here, the physical reality, written without developer language? What is actually missing, the 7 absences named in plain speech for people who've never read a development doctrine? What you can build with almost nothing, the off-grid infrastructure stack as practical instruction. What the forebears carry that you need, the schism named honestly, the complementarity named honestly. How occupation becomes ownership, the sweat equity logic, the contribution economy, the anti-dispossession architecture.
Layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise.
Redeemer Plus planetary deployment. The Earth is now auditable.
Autonomous institutional accountability at scale. A near-term capability projection. Distributed citizen audit networks achieve sufficient density and verification integrity to replace institutional oversight in specific domains. WikiRate's corporate data platform, tracking ESG performance across 50,000 companies using crowdsourced analyst contributions, demonstrated that distributed, structured citizen auditing produces data of comparable or superior quality to self-reported corporate disclosure. The Global Witness Network, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and Bellingcat's open-source intelligence methodology collectively established that non-institutional investigators, operating with open-source tools and distributed coordination, could produce court-admissible evidentiary packages against actors that formal regulators had declined to pursue. These three trajectories, autonomous environmental monitoring, programmable conditional finance, and distributed citizen audit, did not require Redeemer Plus to be invented. They required integration. The planetary audit layer. Redeemer Plus's planetary deployment is not a single system. It is an integration architecture. Every module maps to real operational science. Ecological Liability Score Planet Labs plus SkyTruth plus Global Forest Watch, all operational now. Validation Network MITRE ATT and CK plus Ushahidi plus Bellingcat, 3 proven distributed audit models. Rats Medicine's Patent Pool plus Integrity Council for voluntary carbon markets, real precedent for programmable obligation instruments. Enforcement Tiers FATF compliance freezes plus RICO asset forfeiture plus UNDRIP, all existing legal architecture.
Wealth concentration is not an accident. It is the emergent output of a system designed to compound advantage. Philanthropy, as currently architected, is that system's pressure valve, enough redistribution to prevent rupture, structured to ensure the allocation decisions remain with the concentrators. Autonomous AI changes the calculus. Redeemer is not a charity platform. It is the infrastructure that makes charity platforms obsolete. Issued under the Pirate First Sovereign Doctrine. Capital is not virtue. Allocation is.
Reality Under Siege, a field guide to cognitive security. Artificial intelligence has dissolved the old corporate framework, leaving highly capable professionals in a state of profound identity disorientation. ALDEA ZAMÁ, a territorial foundation for post-professionals, those who wish to lead their lives as of sovereign operators.
Today, we're giving you the Reader's Digest version of a 2026 manifesto by MXTM that provides a literal survival blueprint for AI-displaced professionals, showing us how to build intentional, self-sustaining communities, starting with a flagship model down in ALDEA ZAMÁ, Mexico. First, we gotta redefine global recognition. You might be wondering, is this about chasing Instagram followers or blowing massive marketing budgets? No way. It's about achieving definitional primacy, basically becoming the foundational model every future project has to reference. Are you just throwing money at marketing, or are you actually writing the dictionary for your industry? You want to be the Kleenex of new community models. Second, let's look at the prototype versus the pattern. So how do you actually scale this? Well, definitely don't just build franchises. If you try to copy-paste that ALDEA ZAMÁ prototype everywhere, it's absolutely doomed to fail. Instead, folks gotta take the open source pattern extracted from it and adapt it to their own unique environments, like maybe abandoned institutional campuses or post-industrial cities. Finally, use the manifesto as your first move. Counterintuitively, you don't start by leasing land or building physical spaces. Nope, you start by publishing a manifesto. Think of it as an intellectual constitution. You're capturing the conceptual territory before a single brick is even laid, creating a framework that the community's physical life is going to eventually animate. Ultimately, creating the next era of human communities isn't about laying bricks first. It's about boldly defining the rules of the game so others can build upon them.